Okay, I'm Myroslav Shkandrij, and the title of the book is In the Maelstrom, the Waffen-SS Galicia Division and its Legacy. It's a very controversial subject that has often been poorly handled. There are contradictory opinions, extremely contradictory opinions about the division. And very often it's either demonized, people have an extremely strange opinion of anybody and everybody who was in any way associated with the division. But on the other hand, it's also in some sectors of Ukraine today, for example, it is seen in a very positive light, partly because there's a war on right now, and military opposition, military struggle with Russia is now viewed in a very different way than might have been viewed 10 or 15 years ago. Well, it's a controversial subject. It's a subject that needs to be studied, and I also felt that I was in a position to do that because I had already worked on nationalism, on the OUN, and I'd also done some work on the Second World War. And I grew up in immigration. I knew some people that had been members of the division. And recently also lots of interviews have been done with division members. These are now available. I was able to use them. That not only were these interviews with people who were in emigration, but also people in Ukraine and in Europe. And the former archives of the KGB, which are now the archives of the SBU, are also available. And they have interviews with men who were captured after the Battle of Brody and were interrogated and then sentenced. So all these materials have now become available, and it was possible to do this. And I was in a position to do it, so I took on this project. The former KGB archives, which are now the SBU archives, the Ukrainian Secret Police Archives, they are in various places in Ukraine, but I was able to use with greatest profit, I was able to use the collection of archives in Ternopil. And that is because the Battle of Brody took place not far from there. And the practice was to interview people in the offices or in the area where they were captured, and to keep the files there. So Ternopil has the richest, I think, the richest collection of interviews and files on captured diviziniki. The reason why I called it the Waffen-SS Galicia Division and its Legacy is because the first third is a study of the division itself, what it was. Many questions have been asked about, what is the difference between a Waffen-SS division and the SS? Were they actually members of the SS? Which they were not. This was a different kind of formation from what we typically know as the SS. So it's how it was formed, what it did, where it was, and what the scholarship is on the division's activities. Now, I also spent time on a lot of time in the book on why they joined, because that is one of the biggest questions that is always asked and discussed. And I also spent time on the issue of accusations of war crimes, because that's the second big issue that has always come up whenever anybody mentions the Galicia Division. But I went through, say, the first third of the book were the events of the war, but I also realized that there has been this long, unique to German military formations, long discussion lasting 70, 80 years about the division itself. And so this legacy in journalism, the press, but also in fiction, a lot of novels, a lot of poetry, and a lot of creative literature was devoted to the division. So I went through the legacy of what had been written about the division. And the second third of the book is really about the POW camps in Italy and in the UK, the literature that was produced, the performing arts, the journalism, their arguments about who they were, why they ended up in the German army, and then the literature that was produced afterwards. There was a long, for example, the division members had two journals which they published for many, many decades, in which they published their memoirs. There are many, many memoirs, and they're quite interesting, quite unexpected. So I went through this entire literature. And the last third of the book is really the reassessments of the division in recent times. That begins with the Deschênes Commission, but there was also the Hetherington Commission in the UK and the Menzies inquiry in Australia. Then there was that sparked another debate. And most recently, there have been all sorts of discussions around the division based on the controversies around monuments. What monuments, what insignia should be allowed, both in the West, in Western countries in the West, and in Ukraine. This has become a debate, a discussion in Ukraine. So I tried to cover, not just what happened, but how it has been interpreted over quite a few decades, including up to the present. The gaps or the lack of material is partly about what happened during the war. Because the documentation, the day-to-day documentation on the division's activities is not their book on what was happening on a day-to-day basis. Scholars have done quite a lot of research on this. There are 3 or 4 books that have been done, but not everything about, is known about every place that the division was. So, the scholarship is based on what has been written, other people who have researched different aspects of the division's activities. And there are gaps. I mean, there are gaps about, we don't know everything that went on in Slovakia, where they were for a while. We don't know everything that went on in Slovenia, in Austria, and so on. But there is a lot, and pulling it all together gives you a strong picture of what happened. But the strengths also are in the vast amount of information that was produced after the war, including the memoirs and the various polemics that took place, sometimes between division members themselves, sometimes between members of the spokespeople for the division and the wider Ukrainian community. And those debates, those discussions, and those books that were written have never really been analyzed, never really been looked at carefully. So part of what I try to do is to bring that material into the debate, into the scholarly discussion, and that also involved creative literature, which is surprisingly rich and has probably never been looked at by any scholarship, at least in its entirety. So you're right. Filling the gaps was a big part of what I tried to do, but also to provide an orientation and to lay out the map of what is available, what is still to be looked at, and I have to say also to discount or to explain some of the incorrect views concerning the division. There are many myths about what it did and didn't do, particularly about what it did, because some of these accusations about the division, for example, being in Warsaw during the Ghetto uprising or the Warsaw uprising, are simply not true. They're unfounded. And there's been a lot of scholarship on this by Polish scholars, by Ukrainian scholars. So some of these things have to be, the record has to be put straight about some of these things. And I felt that that was part of my job when I was writing this book. I think that what is happening in scholarship overall is that there are many points of convergence among scholars now. There is a sort of a consensus around many issues, but there also on that continuum, there are various areas that are still contentious. And some of them, there are strong disagreements between scholars, not just in Ukraine, but in Poland and in the West, around some areas. One of the strongest, one of the areas of the strongest contestation is the events in Poland, the so-called Zakierzonia, the area where Ukrainians lived, just across the border in Poland, where there was fierce fighting. So that's still an area that has been discussed actively. There are many issues. I mean, we're not talking about, we're talking about the division and the division's history, because many of the men who went into the division were actually recruited from that area, which was Poland before the Second World War. But there is a contested history in what is Galicia today. Not everything there is quite clear, and there, the Ukrainian-Polish conflict is a big part of that. I would also say that right now in Ukraine, there is a strong interest in the OUN and the UPA, which is different from the scholarly, from what is happening in the scholarship, because there is a tendency to praise, make heroes out of people who were involved in military struggle. And so the area of debate there, I think, is about the OUN and the UPA after the war. Whatever you say about them prior to the war, and a lot of the ideology was not very pretty, and the events of the early part of the war are certainly not a pleasant history. But at the end of the war, and right up to the 50s, they were actually fighting deportations from the Zakrzania area, the Lemko area, and that is now interpreted as a heroic history, a history of heroic struggle. And many of the people who were involved in that were not OUN members. They were in UPA, but they were in fact defending their own ancestral homelands and trying to prevent ethnic cleansing from those homelands. So that's a contentious history to this day. It's not something that has been entirely settled. And it's also a very sensitive history because for Poland, it's not a pleasant history. For Ukrainians in Zakrzania, it's still a very sore point. And it makes understanding the OUN and the UPA complicated because they were sometimes victimizers, sometimes victims. Not an uncommon situation during the Second World War. And so those, sorting out that complexity is not easy. In many ways, it was suicidal. It was completely suicidal, and you have to admire them, particularly at the war's end and afterwards, just for the struggle they put up, and they were actually quite successful. They were the strongest opposition and the longest opposition to Soviet rule. They just could not deal with the Soviet Union, could not deal with them. It took about 300, they had to exile or deport 300 to 400,000 people from Western Ukraine, including entire families. According to some calculations, over 100,000 people, soldiers, fighters were killed. These are huge numbers for an underground that could not be broken. So in many ways, it's amazing what they were able to achieve. But it was, as you pointed out, it was at the end of the war, nobody was interested in what was happening in Western Ukraine, and the Soviet Union was allowed to crush them, and then demonize them. So we are now living with this picture of the OUN and the UPA that has been over many decades created in the Soviet Union, and often simply it's an invention, it's a myth. But yeah, I mean, from today's perspective, where people are fighting a genocidal, aggressive state that is invaded and is trying to destroy all aspects of Ukrainian life, things look different. People now look quite differently at the courage and the determination of these people in the underground. I should also say that the people in the underground then, after they had been captured, were often very prominent in the Gulag, in the camps, organizing things in the camps, meeting the dissidents of the 60s in the camps. This is another aspect of the history that is poorly known, and for many people it's sort of a link between the previous armed struggle and the contemporary one. So there are many interesting stories. I have to say that because you pointed out the interviews, the stories they have to tell are absolutely amazing. You could make films out of any of those stories. They're too amazing to believe sometimes. These people were captured, they escaped, they were captured again, they were sent to the most terrible camps where they often were almost killed. Then was sent elsewhere. They escaped. Some made it to the West. There are many stories that are just film scripts. They're ready to be made it to be. And I was quite amazed by quite a lot of what I discovered. They're not simple stories either. Some of these people um, stayed in Ukraine and survived. One in particular was able to return, became a judge in Western Ukraine, and actually, yeah, he rejoined the Communist Party. Well, he joined the Communist Party, and he survived, and he kind of continued to help Ukrainians as best he could. He had been sent into the Communist Party by the OUN to try and find out what was going on there. And so when he got back, he rejoined the Communist Party. Now, you can't invent some of these stories. They're just too unbelievable to think of. So there's so much there that still needs to be researched and looked at carefully. I think the scholarship is ongoing, always will be. It's never, different generations look at things differently. New facts become available, new information becomes available. The context is constantly changing. So it's never, there's never a final book on something. And I mean, one of the things that I discovered is this constant attempt to kind of demonize either the OUN or the UPA or the division, and refuse to talk about any mitigating circumstances or complicating circumstances or exonerating circumstances. People are just never were interested. And that doesn't go just for Ukrainians. That goes for anybody who was in any way associated with Nazi Germany. After the war, there was this attempt to put everybody who was associated with the German war machine or the German invasion into one sort of category where there were very few distinctions were to be made. Since the 1960s, German scholarship has gone through various phases, various waves, and looks different at the situation. There's been an evolution. So in the immediate post-war years, there was an attempt to make a distinction between the SS and everybody else. So the idea was that the SS had been they were monsters. They were a group of people to themselves, and they ruled. So the German people were not to blame. It was the SS that was to blame. And scholars pointed out that was an alibi. In many ways, it was an alibi for the German people. So since the 1960s, there's been a more complicated view of what happened and who was involved and who was complicit and so on. And then since the 80s and 90s, there's been a strong interest in Eastern European collaborators. In other words, local people who were involved in the Holocaust or who were involved in supporting German war machine and so on. That's where this debate, where Ukrainians come into this discussion, because now they are being asked to respond to various books that have been written about the German occupation in Ukraine. So it's changing all the time. The situation, the scholarship is changing all the time, I think. I mean, there are over 5 million Ukrainians, probably a higher number than that, but at least that number killed. 1.4 million of them were Jews. There were something like 2 to 2.5 million Ostarbeiter, slaves, Ukrainians taken to Germany. It was a horrible situation in which Ukrainians suffered greatly. And so that needs to be part of the context. That needs to be borne in mind when you're looking at issues. I also think that the whole collaboration issue, and I talk about this in my book, the whole issue of collaboration has to be looked at more closely because a lot of these people who were building cooperatives, developing schools, trying to maintain publications, they can be called collaborators, but anybody who survived or tried to survive under German occupation can also be called a collaborator. Distinctions have to be made. I also point out in the book that over 1 million, probably according to some scholars, 1.2 million people from what had been the Soviet Union wore German uniforms. And of that number, 220,000 probably were Ukrainians. That's one of the things that's never talked about. The Soviet Union was the only country that had so many collaborators. Why? What made over 1 million people take up in various forms German uniforms? What was it that motivated them? Unless you answer that question, you don't have a picture of what these people were like and what it was like to survive Stalinism, what was in their heads, what they thought that the war may lead to. And so one of the most important takeaways from a study of the division is the argument that they put forward for joining the division. And that was that they felt they weren't supporters of Hitler. How could they be? Hitler wanted to exterminate the Slavs. He had no interest in supporting Ukrainian statehood. They were aware of that. They also knew that Hitler would lose the war because when the division was being created, it was after Stalingrad. It was clear that Hitler was, the Germans were going to be pushed back on all fronts. So the reason for joining was because Ukrainians felt they needed an army at the war's end. There would be chaos, there would be anarchy, there would at the same time be an opportunity to fight for an independent Ukraine, exactly as had happened in 1918, at the end of the First World War, when an Austrian-trained Ukrainian military called the siege riflemen had been created and became the core of an army fighting for Ukraine's independence. Now, however however fanciful you may think this was, however fantastic their dreams were, this was what motivated people who joined the division, at least the first cohort in 1943, which were highly patriotic youth for the most part. And so they looked forward to either a stalemate at the end of the war, or for many, they thought that the war, at the end of the war, the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers would break down. And at that point, they could switch sides to the West, to the Western side, and fight for an independent Ukraine. Now, you cannot talk about the division without talking about that strategic choice that they made. And so even at the very end of the war, when Churchill was considering Operation Unthinkable, which was challenging Stalin's push to take more territory, Ukrainians were in the division were discussing whether they might become part of that, whether their division may be used to become part of the Western Allied challenge to Stalin. And I should also mention that at the very end of the war and in the late 40s, many Ukrainians from the division were recruited both by MI6 and by the American intelligence, and were parachuted into Ukraine, as radio operators and to make contact with the underground. Hundreds, in fact. Most of them were picked up immediately and executed because Kim Philby was the link man, and he gave them away. But it shows you that they were prepared to fight, and they were immediately prepared to change sides. And their enemy was the Soviet Union, the Red Army. They were fixated on the independent struggle. And if you need more evidence, you could just read the literature, the endless novels they produced, the writings, the journalism. And now the Waffen-SS were largely non-Germans. There were Germans there. They are the core of these divisions. 29 of them were often Germans, but they were recruited from non-German or even non-Germanic peoples. And there's not been much serious scholarship. There is actually a book written on them, the different groups, and takes a much more nuanced view of what's going on. And you're also right, there is a lot of material that needs to be looked at. If you go to Stanford University, to the Hoover Institute, there's the entire the files of the Anders army, Władysław Anders' Second Polish Corps. They collected a lot of materials, and there's a lot there on the division, a lot of unanalyzed and unexplored material. There's plenty of material in other places in Germany as well. So a more detailed and a more thoughtful explanation of what the division, Ukrainian division, the Galicia Division was, still needs to be brought forward into the debate. But yeah, the problem has always been that they've been classified as monsters, not just the Ukrainian Galicia Division, but the word Waffen-SS itself, is already enough to evoke this idea of bloodthirsty killers, the worst of the worst, with a monstrous history, and some of it was. I mean, it was. Clearly, they were a fighting force that was quite brutal, and within the Galicia Division, there were units that are quite awful, quite monstrous. The Dirlewanger Brigade, for a while, which is known as one of the most sadistic groups in the Waffen-SS, that Dirlewanger Brigade was attached to the division briefly. So, you know, the Ukrainians carry the guilt of some of the things that the Dirlewanger Brigade did. I should also mention that there are other, well, to complicate things, there were 4 regiments created out of the volunteers. Only a certain number of volunteers were accepted into the division, and often because of the height requirement, a number of people were put into so-called Galicia SS regiments. They were not the Galicia Division. They were never under the command of the Galicia Division, and they were shipped off to do police work. So very often the charges that are raised, the accusations that of misconduct or war crimes that are raised against the members of the division are in fact charges against these regiments. So the Hutapeniatska accusation, the accusation that a war crime was committed there, cannot be laid at against the Galicia Division per se. It was the one of the regiments or a company from one of the regiments that was there. But it's a complicated discussion, and there are many books now coming out that are looking with much greater detail at what happened. You only have to look at what the Deschênes Commission said. I mean, essentially it said that none of the people that they had been told to investigate were guilty of any war crimes, and the division itself, as a division, was not guilty of war crimes. I mean, that's it. That's the bottom line. And they looked, but other people had looked as well. The Poles had looked at them. The British had looked at them. There had been inquiries. There had been screenings. As a division, it was clear that there was nothing that they could be charged with. So that's the bottom line. But there were people who attached themselves to the division right at the end of the war in order to get out, because that was their best chance of leaving, not being deported back to the Soviet Union. There were people who attached themselves who had a very murky history. And we know that a couple of them had been guards at Trauniki Guards. And so probably have faced trial if they had not died earlier. There were accusations that some of them had been in a unit that had pacified, meaning destroyed a village or several villages. So in each case, the individual has to be looked at, and the charges of criminality have to be explored. But that was not the division as such. I think the furthest you can go is to say that, for example, in Slovakia, the division held back the front, the Red Army. And while it was doing that, Jews in Slovakia were being, late in the war, were being arrested, rounded up, and shipped to Germany, where they were killed. So you can say that the division was complicit in that respect. It had held back the front and possibly delayed the liberation of some places in Slovakia. That's true. But as such, the division was not used in, or we have no evidence that it was used in rounding up Jews. In fact, when I looked at the interviews and I looked at the memoirs, quite a few division soldiers mentioned, this is prior to their signing up, they saw what was happening to Jews. They were witnesses to not just to Jews, but to everybody, but also to Jews. The hangings, the shootings, the herding, and then the executions that took place outside the towns. They witnessed this. And some of them actually joined the division because they said they did not want to be passive victims. If they were going to die with a rifle in their hand. They wanted to have some degree of ability to fight back. And so for them, that actually witnessing what was happening was actually a stimulus to join the division, which is an interesting take on things. No, those stories are remarkable. Those stories of survival are remarkable, and many of them deserve to be turned into something longer, something better known, basically. The ability of human beings to withstand the most amazing pressure and the most difficult circumstances is inspiring. But also, I was also shocked that some former members of the division went into the underground and were party to atrocities. That was not something I expected. It takes all kinds to make an army. There are all kinds of people, and sometimes those people are not particularly astute or behave particularly well, especially in difficult circumstances. So it's a mixed bag, but the bottom line is that as a division, it was a disciplined group, except for what is known in the war histories as aims. These are accidents, incidents, and mavericks. These occur, and these are moments where people are not under the control of their offices, and where they do things that are despicable. This does happen. It's important that people know the full story, and that all these things that need talking about, that they are talked about. All these discussions take place, and that people don't hide or try to gloss over things. The more so because right now there is a war going on, and there is this tendency in some circles to glamorize aspects of the Second World War. Now, there are people, there was a march fairly last year in Kiev where there were people who tried to recreate the division, walked around, with helmets with swastikas on them. This sort of, it's puerile, it's infantile. And in fact, the division members would never have supported that. They never used that insignia in anything that they organized after the war. But people need to know in greater depth what happened, why it happened, and the complexity of wartime struggle. That's something that they're learning now. It's been awful. I mean, nobody expected things to be this bad, but we have a genocidal, aggressive power that is trying to eliminate Ukraine as a people, as a nation, as a state. It has broken every rule of wartime conduct. It is committing atrocities everywhere. And Ukrainians have realized that they have to win this war. Otherwise, they will not exist as a people, as a state, as a nation, as a language. So there's no turning back. I think it's from the Ukrainian point of view, it's all or nothing. What else is there to say? It's been just a horrific revelation. I also think that Russian studies is going to change. There's no way there's no way now you can talk about Russian studies, Russian culture, Russian literature in the same way. All this is going to be now looked at in an entirely different light. The ugliness of Russian literature, the imperialism, the aggression in Russian culture, these things have to be taken up, and Slavic departments around the world will have to deal with this. Furthermore, the whole history of Russia has to be rewritten. I'm not the first one to say this, but it has to be seen in a bigger context, in a longer time span. The Russian Empire, its treatment of minorities, its contempt for other states, its suppression of other languages and cultures, all that is part of what is going on today. And Putin is a throwback to pre-Soviet times, pre-1917, to a Russian imperial stance that refused to recognize Ukraine and its existence and its language even. So all this is going to transform, I think, attitudes towards Russia, Russian culture, and Eastern Europe. And I think it could be even deeper than that. We may be witnessing the collapse of Russia as a state, the way we know it now, because other nationalities, other national groups within Russia, the Russian state, are restive and may force the issue. There's a huge demographic problem in Russia today. People are leaving. There's no appetite for glorifying the exploits of Putin and his soldiery, and so we may be looking at a major decline of Russian power and a dismemberment of the state. The reason why I'm saying that is because I have heard these discussions, and people are looking at these issues in a different light today. It's a long process, and not everybody is on board, but there is a strong sense that that Russian studies has missed the boat. These events of the last year changed the picture completely.